I'm here to talk about climate positive growth and a little bit about my own background. I would love to say that, like Anne, I was conscious of the challenges facing the planet and moved by that sense of crisis into the work I am doing now. That would be untrue. Until 4 or 5 years ago, I was focused in a very narrow way on a very simple question that I know a number of you here have spent a lot of time and effort working on, which is how do we get Africa's booming young population into dignified livelihoods as quickly as possible. It's a task I'd spent 15 years applying my mind to in a range of ways. And in 2019, I had a little bit of a crisis of faith. I applied some very complex mathematical analysis called addition, multiplication, and division to the data that I was seeing across the work that I'd been doing up until then. And I had to conclude that we were losing the race, and it's obvious, we are losing the race to generate enough dignified livelihoods on the continent to absorb all of that young potential that is coming up on the continent. And as a result, that potential is sweeping away our institutions, it's sweeping away our nations, it's sweeping away social stability. It's no longer a might, it is happening, we're seeing it time after time. So in 2019, I asked the question, what would it take to actually create jobs at that scale? And the answer was, well, we need to fundamentally change Africa's position in the global economy. What would that take? And the more time I spent, and I had access to a large team of consultants, having built a consulting firm, what came back surprised me. It was climate positive growth. And you were wondering what that means, and I will tell you. So when we talk about climate and climate change, a lot of times the picture starts somewhere like this, right? This is the picture of Africa in the climate dialogue. It is a farmer, typically a woman, struggling with the scourge of a depleted landscape, record failures of rain, drought, etc., still scraping a livelihood in the face of increasing climate stress without the resources to pay for adaptation or resilience, and importantly, kind of forbidden from the pathway that has seen other places become rich, which is increase your emissions to increase your well-being. So stuck in that area. This is the moral argument around climate change in Africa. Other people caused it, we're feeling the brunt of it, we didn't benefit, we are owed climate justice. From a moral perspective, it's completely correct. I do not disagree with it in any of its particulars. The scale of the transfers that would be required to actually do this, the way that we say would be needed, are on the scale of hundreds of billions of dollars a year to make up for the amount of climate damage that Africa will face. And there is no country in history that has given away that kind of money except after losing a war of conquest. So if you want to do climate justice the way that we argue it, from a moral perspective, you need to build an army and plan which of the big OECD countries you're going to invade first and do reparations from. So if that's not possible, then what? Now, let's begin with how development has traditionally worked, right? If you look at history, if you look at the current global picture, if you look at countries by their emissions intensity and their GDP per capita, you see a very clear pattern, right? You grow your emissions, then your GDP goes up, and maybe you start moving towards services and your emissions come down a little bit, right? But poverty and low emissions are kind of interrelated, right? The challenge here is if Africa does what other parts of the world have done in terms of increasing their emissions per capita as we get wealthier, all of that data around how bad climate change is already for the continent will get worse. Indeed, there's an argument that the climate will get worse faster than we can get richer, so our actual standard of living will decline if we use the old models. So again, underlining the injustice of the current situation. Now, we know that we need to get to net zero by 2050, right? And just conceptually, let's think about what that means. We need to get to removing as much carbon as we're emitting, vastly reducing the amount of carbon or greenhouse gases we're emitting, and then making up for the piece that we can't get rid of by 2050. Countries around the world, since the Paris Agreement, have made commitments to get to net zero. Some countries just said very clearly, we can't do it by 2050. We are late emerging, newly industrialized countries. We just finished building our coal plants and our gas-powered power plants. Retiring these before 2070 will be economically ruinous for us. So that gives us already a portion of the path to net zero that we don't have. A whole bunch of others said, yeah, we can afford it, we'll totally do it. And then, the party of the green or the left lost power, and the party of industry and so on came into power, and all of them are behind schedule. Virtually no country is ahead or on track or ahead of track to get to net zero right now. Actually, one interesting exception is China, but we'll come back to that, right? So there's a lag there. So you add up those two things, the people who already told you, sorry, boss, we're not going to get to zero, and the ones who said, yeah, we'll totally do it, but are not on track, and you have a surplus of emissions vis-a-vis where we need to get to by 2050. And this is not some academic question. It's an existential question for the planet in terms of livability. Because keep in mind, climate change keeps getting worse until you get to zero and beyond. Right? It just keeps getting worse, right? No matter what, it'll keep on getting worse, and it's already pretty bad. So net zero implies that there's another category of countries that exist. The word net in net zero implies that there's another category of countries that can get to zero and go beyond it in the other direction. And the question is, where will those countries, where will those companies, where will those individuals, where will those spaces be found on the planet? Because they need to be found. Now, what the penny that dropped for me in late 2019 and became an obsession that led to my completely reinventing my career was that Africa has a very unique positioning. That the assets that the continent has, which are its renewable energy potential, its young and growing workforce, and its endowments of natural resources, and I don't just mean the stuff under the ground. It's our geology, yes, but it's also our latitude, it's our biodiversity, it's our coastlines, right? We've got more tropical real estate than any other part of the world, and that's going to be really important in the race to net zero. Those three elements together open up a different path, a different way of thinking about Africa's contribution to the global climate equation. If you look at the data today, Africa is about 4%. We are very fond of saying, don't ask us to do anything on climate change, we're only 4% of the problem. Well, who said that being 4% of the problem means you can only be 4% of the solution? Not for free, by the way, right? And that means three pathways to being climate positive. The first one is low emissions, consumption and production. It means leapfrogging to green technologies. And not doing it in the sense of, hey, let's eat a green premium, let's pay more than we would otherwise have, but actually recognizing that technologies have changed. And in sector after sector, you look at where the technologies stand today and where they are going, and it is actually in most African countries' interest to leapfrog to green technologies already. The business case for e-mobility, the business case for cleaner cooking that reduces deforestation, the business case for just going renewables heavy in our energy systems is actually pretty strong from a pure commercial basis, right? And there will be exceptions, but actually for the most part, we are at the right point to be adopting technologies that others would have to kind of incur some, for some people, they'll need to write off what they have and move forward. For Africa, we're greenfield, not brownfield. So it's actually cheaper to go green from the start. The second area is producing for the world. And the way I characterize this is, it's that purchase order that you heard about yesterday, right? And Uncle Leko talked about the fact that the world over the next 25 years is going to put out the biggest purchase order for green technology and green production in human history. And the places in the world that can deliver on that value proposition will become the new centers of global economic activity. And the third opportunity is removing carbon. It's recognizing that we are going to overshoot any sort of comfortable level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We already have, frankly. And that to get to net zero and beyond, we will need to build a new massive industry that builds on nature, first of all, restoring and protecting our natural ecosystems, and then augments that with a whole range of other interventions to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and get us back to a comfortable range for the climate. Remember, the problem with climate change isn't that it's bad for the planet. The planet will be absolutely fine. It's us who will have the problem, right? I hear people say, well, animals are going extinct. Well, that's, why should I care? Well, you are an animal, right? If you're comfortable going extinct, then we're fine. And if you're not comfortable going extinct, then there is no choice but to do carbon removal at scale in addition to the other two things I talked about. The way that this manifests, remember that 2x2, that dual axis? So you've got your GDP per capita and your emissions per capita. And what you see there is you see low emissions consumption and production is about taking our African countries that are down there, and instead of going out this way, going up this way in terms of our own consumption. How we construct, how we feed ourselves, and so on. How do you improve productivity without increasing emissions? Producing for the world is about taking other people's high-energy industries and shifting them to the people with lots of renewable energy and lots of the right kinds of natural resources. And removing carbon is about treating this line here the same way that my 8th grade maths teacher taught me to think about zero. It's just another number. It's not the last one. There's numbers on this side too. You can get paid for this, right? This is work, and it's valuable. And in a world that begins to value emissions, begins to price carbon, being able to do this, and being able to do this at massive scale, is one of the great economic opportunities of this century. So what does it look like? It's backed by data. It needs to focus on narrative and advocacy. There's policy and regulation, and there's proofs of concept. I'm just going to really sprint through just to land a few provocations. The first one is young people want this story. No one likes to be a helpless and hapless victim. Saying to our young people that you're not just the victims of the bad decisions of multiple generations of people from other parts of the world, but you are the generation that is called to save the world, is an energizing and exciting proposition if it also translates into jobs and purpose. The second thing is, it makes fundamental economic sense in ways that are really inarguable. This is one piece of analysis that a think tank I helped set up, the Climate Action Platform Africa, did, just looking at the economics of renewables. And the point it's making, which blew our minds, is that if you take two countries, let's just say Kenya, for kicks, and Germany, and you said, if I wanted to get the same amount of 24/7 firm power with renewables only, so wind, solar, and storage, how would that work? And let's exclude the cost of borrowing because that's kind of a human-imposed constraint. Well, firstly, you're going to need a lot fewer panels to generate the same amount of energy as Germany's wind and solar installations, about 3x less expenditure on the underlying generation system. And you don't have winter. So your battery is a heck of a lot smaller, or your storage costs are a heck of a lot smaller. The net effect is it costs 3x less to generate the same amount of farm power. Now, again, the banks then extract a huge chunk because, of course, you're paying a very different interest rate. But if this is even partially true, and keep in mind, each of these things here are getting cheaper and more efficient by the day, then it is fair to say that inevitably the world's cheapest green electrons will eventually be found in Africa. It is an inevitability of physics, right? It may take a while because of all of the barriers we put in the way, but it's an inevitability. What do we do with that? Well, here's one suggestion, right? Let's not think so much about energy supply. We talk about the 600 million Africans who don't have access to basic energy, and we should serve them. A big question is, how do we pay for that energy grid? This is one provocation. Africa's bauxite exports, which are then processed into aluminium elsewhere in the world, today the processing of them accounts for roughly 1% of global carbon emissions because they're being processed in usually fossil fuel heavy grids elsewhere in the world. And yet Africa has a superabundance of untapped renewable energy. 60% of the world's best solar, 40% of the world's blended best renewable potential, 50 times the projected energy demand of the entire planet in 2040 is available in Africa. If we just said, you know what, why don't we ship aluminum instead of bauxite? That's the economic impact right there, right? That's how many tons of carbon, that's how many jobs, that's how much annual revenue and this is how much new energy you're underwriting. It is massively complex to make this happen, but I put it out there as a provocation. This is how you don't find 1% immediate reductions in global emissions every day. Arturo can tell you, right? 1% is hard to find. This one requires not a single new technology, not a single new business model. Just move where we do things. And the positive externalities for the parts of the world where you do this would be massive in terms of jobs, in terms of economic transformation. You could draw a very similar picture for our problematic AI data centers. You could draw a very similar picture for them. Any energy-hungry industry, we should be asking ourselves, which ones should Africa be competing for on the basis that we are the one place in the world with functionally infinite green energy headroom. And then there's our nature-based assets, which are another opportunity. I will not spend too much time on this. What we did was to go country by country and actually say, at different prices of carbon, how many jobs, how many tons of carbon, and what level of revenue could individual African countries realize in a world where we were properly pricing emissions. We're not in that world yet. We need to get there, and it's important not just for the planet and for climate, it's important for Africa's economic competitiveness. And so I'll pause here, but the point I'm making is think about the challenge of climate change and the imperative of climate action as a task that must be undertaken, also known as a job, a very big job, and a job which, unlike jobs that are driven by pure consumer impulse, will eventually be driven by our desire to survive as a species. So it's an inevitable job. We will have to do it. How do we take advantage of our indigenous potential to position Africa as a leader in that journey versus a follower in making the planet a worse place than we found it? Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. And I think what I get out of it, it's so nice to feel hopeful on this topic occasionally. And James, because you know that I wasn't going to let this point go when you said you got into climate because of competitiveness and jobs. But now that you have found yourself deep into climate, and I mean, it's been strange to me in this particular week. I don't know why, but I've been asked 3 times actually by different people if, you know, isn't this just another extinction event? You know, what is this real concern about climate? So I mean, you alluded to it in your talk, but maybe, you know, as you've dived into it, you know, what do you really feel about it now? Has the moral imperative emerged, I guess?
So I've never questioned the moral imperative in the first instance. It has always been there. I think at this point you can sort the world into those who believe in climate change and unserious people. I think, you know, I don't know how many of you watched the show Succession, Logan Roy saying to his children that they are not serious people. But look, the evidence is inarguable. So if the question is climate change real? On that one, I don't think an African living on the continent can claim not to see it, right? Just 3 years ago, this city came within how many days of running out of its last drop of available potable water? And let's be clear, right? A few days either way and you're evacuating a major African city, right? And it's not clear that that's not inevitable, right? It's actually not clear that that's not even inevitably going to eventually happen. And we can repeat those instances. And, you know, any of you reading newspapers will know, I think we're in our 15th straight month that is the hottest month on record.
Yeah.
Right? Breaking a record, you know, every month now is the new hottest month in human history. So yeah, for those who say this is just another extinction event, they are completely right. And in another 1,000,000 years, you will come back on Earth and it will be thriving. There'll even be a new dominant species, maybe descended from cockroaches. And if you are fine with that, then that's okay. If you're okay with being extinct, then that do you, right? But don't deny that we are in an extinction event and we are subject to the same forces. And I have kids, but it doesn't actually matter whether you have kids or not. You should have a stake in your ability to live a full and viable life. Those of us who practice the Islamic faith, it's becoming really critical. How doable would the Hajj be in the future? Last year we had a death toll of, this year we had 1,500 people die. That only goes in one direction. And that's just one example of the ways that it's affecting our life. So let's not have a debate about whether climate change is real. If you are saying you're not a serious person, then you're not a serious person.
Yeah.
Let's leave it there.
Yeah, and I think the immeasurable suffering between that and extinction, both for ourselves and other species, is something that needs to bring positive energy and commitment, and I think innovation, which is what you're doing, and I think, you know, I'm going to pick up on the question because it was interesting for me of the person who came up in the break to speak to you. I mean, I think if you look on the continent, we topped and tailed by Middle East and North Africa above us, and South Africa, which is still largely coal, but with a plan. And there's a huge influence on the continent, a growing influence from China and others. And we tend to have a caricature, as you said, of climate villains. And I'd be interested to just get your view on the role of perhaps Middle East, North Africa to a lesser extent, China, in how you are thinking, and some of the ideas you had in terms of capital decrease in costs.
Yeah. So I'll start in a slightly different place, but adjacent. I think the first thing we also need to banish from ourselves is this assumption that in embracing a green future, Africa is being denied the chance to exploit some disproportionate wealth of fossil fuels. That it's, you know, why shouldn't we use them? You know, you take the proven reserves you take production in Africa and you take proven reserves in Africa and you divide it by the population of Africa, and Africa is actually under-endowed in fossil fuels. Now, the fossil fuels are there, we just haven't found them. But again, it's not as if you know, the countries we think of as oil-rich in Africa don't crack the top 10 globally. So that's the first thing. We're not being pushed away from like some pool of abundance. Now, turn to the second aspect of this, which is how are countries evolving on this? Until a few years ago, it was very common to say, well, you know, China is really the country that matters because they have such a big share of global emissions. They're not moving fast enough, and if they're not, why should we? We're just a rounding error. And what that obscured is China 15 years ago made a bet. They made a bet that the future of energy, the future of transportation, the future of basically everything is green electricity. And they bet their entire economy on it, right? The dominant sectors in the Chinese economy today, photovoltaics, renewable equipment, electrolyzers, etc., batteries, and e-mobility. And in 15 years, they pivoted their whole economy. And I said earlier, when you look at the data, China is consistently beating their targets for how much renewables they were going to roll out in their own country and how much capacity to build they were going to build. And that's what happens when you begin to orient the economic incentives of a country aligned with our climate goals rather than kind of indifferent to them. Now, the reason that's relevant is it's driving a collapse in cost, right? And we've seen it, right? I think PV, you know, a solar plus storage installation today costs 1/10 as much as it did 12 years ago. And that trajectory is accelerating, not decelerating. The Economist did an interesting analysis. If you looked at the projections of energy sector experts, including experts in the renewable energy industry, on the projections on the price of renewable energy over time, and you compared them to the projections of climate activists, the first thing is the climate activists were wrong. Right? They said that energy...
I'm not one anymore.
No, but, no,
I'm joking.
Own it.
I'm joking.
Own it. No, you were wrong. You were wrong. The climate activists, they had a very ambitious... They were saying that energy prices would fall, renewable energy prices would fall at least twice as fast as the energy sector experts were saying they would fall. So they were at least 2x ahead of them. They were wrong, but the energy experts were wrong by more. Right? So actual price collapses have gone 2 or 3 times the most ambitious expectations of the climate activists, not the technical experts. They were not even in the neighborhood. And so when we draw these curves out, it's important to keep an eye on the fact that we are in the midst of a new kind of technology that's obeying a version of Moore's law, right? You're seeing innovation stacking on top of each other, and you're seeing unprecedented increases in efficiency, efficacy, and price. A lot of that is being driven by China. But remember, no matter how good a solar panel gets, a simple fact remains. No matter how well a solar panel performs in Germany, it'll perform 3 times better in Kenya. Forever, right? Because you can't buy, I usually tell someone what my basketball coach told me in high school. I was practicing my skills and so on, and at some point he came to me and said, it's not gonna work. I can't teach height, right? I cannot teach height. And in renewable energy, you cannot teach latitude. You just cannot teach latitude. Right? And the most energy-dense corridor on planet Earth is between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. And if you have landmass in that area, you're in luck. Energy is going to be getting a lot cheaper, a lot faster for you than for anyone else. So that's China's role.
Yeah.
Thank you to them. Thank you. We'll buy that stuff. The Middle East is becoming, because fossil fuels are still very profitable, one of the largest concentrations of capital on the planet. And if, like any smart capital allocator, you should probably be looking at investing in things that are counter-cyclical to the thing that you are making your money from. And so I think we need to be thinking about how do we tap that pool of capital towards investing in Africa's green energy and unlocking Africa's green productivity, because you don't just focus on demand, you also focus on supply. Yeah. And bring those two things together. So I think that there is a win-win-win available here that's good for a whole range of actors that typically think of a green transition as bad for them, but actually unlocks a whole range of potential opportunities for growth for the planet and for individual economies.
So James, I know one of your theses, and just picking up what you said, is to effectively lock in demand for green energy production on the continent, and use that locking in of demand to drive competitiveness, but also to drive the rollout of our own grids and electrify more of the continent. And I mean, when you listen, you're so compelling. So I guess the question I'm asking is, what are you finding on that investment pathway? I mean, what kind of responses are you getting? And what do you think? You said, China bet the economy. So what responses are you getting from investors? What responses are you getting from governments in Africa? And what do we really need to do as people of influence in this room to move the needle? Or are you seeing the needle move as quickly as you'd like it?
So the first thing I'll say is about how African governments have reacted to this. Part of the reason I always lead with, and we spent months workshopping. The very first time climate positive growth was written was literally actually on the back of a napkin. It really was, in a restaurant in Zanzibar, where we were saying, how do we pitch this to governments? And what I found was the minute that you were talking to leaders about a new economic opportunity rather than an obligation, you got a very different reception. And the minute you were able to say, you know what? Let's presume we do not care about the planet, just run the math. You also got a very different reaction. And I remember sitting with a very senior member of the Nigerian government, about as senior as it gets, and saying to them, let us presume that we have no obligation to lower our emissions. Show me a model that makes sense to go for a carbon-intensive industrialization of Nigeria, and let me show you the alternative, and let's argue about the assumptions that underpin it, but I'll bet you anything, I could spot you 30% of what you've got right now, and I'd still win the race. And it was true, right? The resources on the continent are just that good. We are not used to thinking through the economics of the counterfactual. So that's the first thing. So that's important. And then there's a question of how do you actually bring demand to the continent? So part of what I'm doing now, and I'm still a beginner in this, I'll bet you anything there's people here who know a lot more about the energy sector, large-scale investment. But we've been investing in companies, some of which try to do exactly this, is attract large-scale demand to the continent. And what we're looking for is industries for whom the advantage of being in Africa is so vast that it makes up for all of the other problems that we heard about that retard our industrial development. One of the ones that we went for was direct air carbon capture, an energy-intensive industry that needs a geothermal source of energy and a source of sequestration. And it turns out that the best place on planet Earth to do direct air carbon capture is in East Africa. Interestingly, because you're bringing something new, it's actually a pretty straightforward conversation. You just need to show that you can deliver. Also, interestingly, it solves a different problem. People say, why would we use scarce electricity in Kenya for direct air carbon capture instead of for electrifying homes? It ignores the fact that Kenya has 3 gigawatts of power on our grid. We have 4 gigawatts of projects waiting in a queue for power purchase agreements. Everything has been done. They're waiting just for someone to say, I will buy the power. So Africa, in many countries, what we have is a demand problem, not a supply problem. And if we can bring the demand, then we can finance the supply and we can get the system to move, get those young people in work, and so on. So there's an opportunity here to create that virtuous cycle, but it sometimes involves turning the problem on its head. If you don't have enough energy, maybe it's because you don't have enough energy demand, not the problem with supply.
And you speak about locking in the demand from an investment perspective, infrastructure investment, because this is going to take serious infrastructure investment. What kind of responses are you getting from private sector investors?
So I think, again, very early stage, but positive. And so I don't want to prejudge some of the challenges that I know people in the room will have dealt with better than I have. But one thing I'll observe is one consequence of the shift in the nature of how energy is generated and consumed. If you look at where the technologies are going, is I think and you're seeing it, think about the mining companies in South Africa bringing their energy supply into their own plant, basically saying we will build the energy as well as the plant, because actually relying on a grid and a national utility doesn't make much economic sense in a world where you can actually build your own enclosed system for relatively inexpensively and de-risk yourself. So what we are seeing is a shift in how people think about the deployment of energy-hungry industries, where the energy is blended in. You're not looking for energy investors and industry investors. You're looking for industry investors who will also invest in energy. And in the process of doing so, you're building an ecosystem of folks who know how to build the energy installations, can deploy them, and so on, which is good for the rest of the economy in some way, shape, or form, and creating jobs.
Yeah. Thank you, James. I want to open it up because I know there are lots of interested people in the audience. So I'm going to open it up to questions for James.
Hi, my name is Rita van der Skeef, and I recently worked on a regional development strategy in Namibia around green hydrogen development. Yeah. And what I found in that project, there's a bit of challenge, is everybody's buying into what you're saying, so huge amounts of enthusiasm. The challenge that I observed is lack of implementation momentum, especially from the public sector. Yeah. What would be your advice? So if everybody's agreeing with you, how do we pick up the pace to capitalize on it and to actually implement?
So I'll give 2 parts of the answer. I'm a big fan of what Nigeria has been trying to do with hyphen, with a little bit of a caveat, and I'll come to the caveat at the end, because I think it's really ambitious in some ways, potentially too ambitious on some dimensions, and on other dimensions not ambitious enough. So, and for those of you who don't know, Namibia is positioning itself to build up a massive hydrogen export economy, sending hydrogen into European industry. So green hydrogen, powered by renewable energy. I think the challenge of it being too big is you're asking our public sectors to embark on these massive, ultra-high capex initiatives where you'll be working for 15 years before you see, or for X number of years before you see any return. And that means everyone's working blind. They don't know what it is that they're building towards. We don't have an internal domestic understanding of the kind of economy you're building. And I would argue that we're seeing too many kind of multi-gigawatt green hydrogen projects and not enough 100-megawatt green hydrogen projects, right? deploy it, let's see what it does, let's see what we can do with it, let's actually put it into action. That's the first thing. And so it just becomes too big to digest. It's not ambitious enough on a different dimension, which is, in a way, it's a natural resource play, right? You're mining Namibian sunshine and wind and shipping it abroad in the form of hydrogen. And that, I think, has a different problem, which is hydrogen is just a really hard thing to move. And I think lots of people around the world who've embarked on mega green hydrogen projects for pure export, either as hydrogen or as green ammonia, are running into this problem of you're taking pretty big systems losses all the way through. That doesn't change the fact that doing green hydrogen is a really good idea. It might beg the question, why would you ship it as hydrogen and not just take the next 3 or 4 steps where you're making the hydrogen?
Yeah.
Right? I was pointing out, like, one of the big uses of the green hydrogen from Namibia would be to combine it with iron ore in Germany to make green steel. You've got a lot of high-quality iron ore in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Just do it here. Ship the green steel. So there's something there about actually asking that question. In a new world, we've built a global industrial sector where a lot of our industry is concentrated in OECD countries, most of which are outside of that golden belt of the tropics, right? And we did that because IP and expertise was hard to move, and energy was very easy to move for most of industrial history. So we ship barrels of oil or shiploads of gas, etc. We're moving into a world where that is exactly inverted. The knowledge on how to do things is relatively easy to move, right? But actually energy is very hard to move. And that creates a different way of thinking about projects like Hyphen. I'll maybe end with a very quick example. In Kenya, there's a company called Talus that's doing green ammonia, but containerized, single megawatt scale, on farm, straight to fertilizer. Right? The exact same chemical process, the exact same advantages, but what they're calculating is that fertilizer is so expensive in Africa that if you just do distributed green ammonia, you're already in the money, because one of the most expensive uses of ammonia today is in African agriculture. If you can undercut that, you can then come down the cost curve on that. So there might be other ways to think about green hydrogen and how you deploy it that could make it more bite-sized and manageable.
Thanks, James. And I think you bring an important point in terms of thinking differently. Let's also move away from just exporting as we have historically done. And I'm going to come to you. I'm going to take other questions, but I want to come to you on dumping carbon in Africa. Riza.
Hi, thanks, James. So one of the things that South Africa is struggling with is the movement away from coal, right? And so the just energy transition has been a strategic priority for the presidency. It's a strategic priority for Eskom. And South Africa has built up a lot of its competitive advantage on coal-based derivative products. Yeah. So can I just get your opinion? Because one of the difficulties that we've been talking about when we look at the numbers, and we don't see quick net positive employment growth. We see net negative employment growth in the short term before there's any hope of turning that around. So it's not a just transition, it's an unjust transition South Africa faces. And the question is just how unjust is it going to be before we see a turnaround? So my question is, in your some sort of assessment of South Africa, which is very different from East Africa, with a different transition, how do you see the ability to accelerate these investments so that that unjust transition is as short as possible?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. One challenge I'll offer is South Africa is different from East Africa in 2 ways. One, it has a bigger deployed fleet of fossil fuel energy plants, coal. But 2, it has an even bigger endowment of high-quality renewable energy. And I think we've framed the question of the just transition wrong. We framed it as how do we undo a bad thing, right? And that's what we're focused on, versus how do we make the most of a good thing. If I could go back to Glasgow, I would have said that the conversation is not about how we shut down the 30 gigawatts. They will shut down naturally. Many of them are near end of life, etc. The question should have been, how do we build 150 gigawatts of green and bring demand and industry to the country as a major global green manufacturing hub, which is it is uniquely positioned to be. Unlike almost the rest of Africa, you have high-quality ports, you have existing industrial hubs, you have manufacturing experience, you have existing infrastructure. And as you saw, the minute the thumb came off the scale, PV began flowing into this country just from private initiative, right? But still, we're still doing it at a Mickey Mouse level as a continent, and by extension, South Africa as a country. China last year installed 300 gigawatts of solar. South Africa has way better solar resources than China does, and we did less than 100th of that. I'll say we. And so my argument is, you need to turn this on its head. The question is, where's the big South African push? Where's the big South African push at the next COP saying, we can provide 200 green gigawatts for data centers, for metals processing, much of which is going through our ports anyway, for manufacturing, batteries, this, that, the other. Anyone who wants to come, what incentives do you need to come here and underwrite? We will take coal down to 10% of our power grid, but not by shutting down coal plants, but by building out the green. And as you're doing that, this turns into a rounding error. The old stuff becomes a rounding error. Right now, we are so caught up in the most important things we've ever done are behind us, and we must hold on to it. We're in a world of loss aversion, and it blinds us to the sheer blinding potential of this country as a global industrial leader. So that's the challenge I would put forward.
Thanks, James. I'll come to you next, Eddie. Thank you. Yes, I think that does deserve. Sorry, sir?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, James. Can you clarify how you see the role of public sector versus private sector, and who needs to take the lead here for this future to happen?
That one is easy. It's going to be private sector led, public sector enabled. I think one of the things I've come to believe, but again, call it the naivety of relative, well, not even relative youth, of being new to a sector. I do believe that for a lot of renewables, government's primary role is going to be getting out of the way, right? And creating some enablers, but actually inviting private capital as quickly as possible and as smoothly as possible to enter into the different sectors in the different ways, whether it's direct use of renewables directly for industry, where you're just basically saying, I will enable as much as possible of you being able to build your own energy supply, if that's what you have chosen to do. Or it is in saying, well, okay, how do we really focus on getting transmission right? Because yes, transmission is important because it allows us to balance with a bit less storage. So there's a role for government. It's not in reaching into our very tiny fiscus to try and fund this transition. We can't afford it, right? I'm embarrassed when I see an African head of state going to open a 20 megawatt plant, right? We are not serious countries, right? How do we go to gigawatts? It's not going to be initially with our own budgets, but there's money out there that can do it. We just need to have government alongside innovators in the private sector put together the propositions, right? But the real role is going to be in the private sector actually understanding where the technologies are going, where the sectors are going. I find a lot of Africans show up to these conferences and saying, well, what's everyone else doing? You know, they're the proof of the old adage. The way Africa shows up to COP is proof of the old adage, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? We're just sitting there arguing for the climate reparations. We're not in the room asking about what's the future of the hydrogen economy and how could we maybe capture a big slice of that, right? And so we wait. Oh, someone has come. They want to do a project in our country. We don't understand it. No one in the country understands it, but they're offering us a few $1 million. Let's do it. And you're on the menu.
Thanks, James. Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, really just building on this last point. I mean, I think there are a number of us here who've been involved in working with the South African government on the energy transition. And I think, you know, one of the things that is clear, and I suppose this is clear in a number of other countries as well, is that, you know, politics gets in the way of this, and the interests, the vested interests, as well as very ideological positions and other things, you know, have created major obstruction. I mean, I think the economic argument that you make is absolutely 100% clear, and in South Africa, we often talk about, if you're going to introduce other energy technologies today, like baseload gas or nuclear and so on, we're basically spending significantly more money on energy than we need to spend. So if you say by 2050 we're going to spend another 50 billion rand a year in today's money on energy that we don't need, will we not rather spend that money on education or healthcare or, it makes no sense at all. And so, I think that's an easy argument to win, but the mechanism for enabling the significant expansion, we need 50,000 megawatts of renewables in South Africa over the next 10 years, around 10,000 megawatts of storage. We need to spend 300 billion rand on transmission. We need to tenfold the infrastructure spend on transmission that we're doing today. Practically how you enable that is, the challenge that we're kind of facing into with government now. And when we look at the capacity you need for these reforms, so when you think about private sector, you need like wheeling arrangements for wheeling through the grid. You need grid access rules for who gets access to the grid and what are the rules and how's that going to work. There's huge complexity in this. And, one of the members of our team did a trip to the UK recently. They've got hundreds of people, just engineers, modelers, just focusing on this issue. And I think the mechanism for how you, deal with vested interests and elites who have an interest to subvert this. To the point about the transition is happening. Yeah. So it's not like, should we do this or shouldn't we do this? Yeah. There's a revolution happening in energy in South Africa. These coal-fired power stations are going to get decommissioned. No new coal-fired stations are going to get built. So this is happening. But how you kind of accelerate and make possible the massive wall of private investment, which is actually there for energy. We see it in this country. The banks have approved over 1,000 infrastructure projects in generation, hundreds of billions of rands. But there's a huge amount of regulatory changes that are needed to actually make all of this possible, which is kind of what the challenge is now. And I think, we've applied a lot of capacity to this in South Africa, but this is going to be a huge challenge across the continent.
So the last consulting project I did in my previous life was I worked with a team to do a new energy white paper for the government of Kenya at the end of the previous administration. And this was a 20-year view of the energy sector. And we wrote it on the instruction of the minister who'd heard me probably spouting off at an event somewhere and said, okay, if this is so clear, well, how would you do it? And the answer we gave was, a lot of time is spent really charting the path of supply, right? There's a very supply-side bias in how we think about how you build out energy sectors. What we haven't done that can change the political economy of this is really flesh out demand. Not just in terms of, well, the economy will grow and we'll need more, but so-and-so wants 5 gigawatts in 2 years' time, and they will come and they will build X in location Y, if you can provide that. Right? Or they will actually finance it if you will concession the space to do it, right? It's actually tackling energy from the perspective of many of the world's most capitalized companies are desperate for places where they can get functionally infinite green energy headroom to run their processes. And if you line up the demand on that side, it changes a couple of things. One, it makes the whole thing more bankable. So it's not just about the South African balance sheet or local banks' balance sheets. It's about, well, Google's going to have to find a place to put all of their data centers, and they're willing to just pay for it out of quarterly profits, right? That's one thing. The other thing is it changes the political economy a bit. So to the extent that I have some side hustle that is influencing me over here, I can see ways I can prosper on this other side as well. We should solve corruption, but you need to give people a sense that there is big economic value on the other side. So that's the one thing I observed is, and maybe it's done, I'll, in all due humility, I'll acknowledge that maybe it doesn't work everywhere, but I do think fleshing out and attracting the demand use cases can begin to change the way that we are thinking about this over time and saying, frankly, leave the incumbents as they are and do this in parallel if you have to, right? But really flesh out this future and what it means for the country for this to be happening and sell investors on that future.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm going to go. Yeah. I'm probably going to take one or two more.
Okay, very quick. 2 things. You do spend a lot of time advising top government officials. What are the top 2 or 3 things you're telling them to do straight away to begin to take advantage, as you're talking about, and going beyond the 20 megawatt situations. The other is there's a lot of noise around carbon credits, injustice for Africa, the pricing.
Yeah.
Can you clarify that the signal from the noise, but also your thoughts as to the way forward in order for Africa to really leverage the carbon credit market?
In 30 seconds, I will definitely do
No,
that.
you can go a bit longer.
You have powers, James.
James, you don't do 30 seconds. Okay, I'm just saying.
I'm cursed with verbosity. So let's start with carbon, and then you may have to remind me again of the other page. I just got caught up in the carbon point. Voluntary carbon markets as currently construed do not work. However, they are, they're kind of like, all statistics are inaccurate, some are useful. Similarly, here, or all models are inaccurate, but some are useful. The carbon market, the voluntary carbon markets are pointing in a direction. And I think we need to, as Africans, we need to have more African capacity at the table in shaping the rules of the carbon markets. Not because you're going to move necessarily, the prices are not moved by saying, give us a better price. They're moved by adjusting supply and demand. And you adjust demand by saying everyone has to do something to contribute to improving the global carbon balance. And you improve supply or reduce supply by saying, take the crappy, counterfeit, or low benefit stuff out of the market, right? And doing that in an informed way is the first step. What's a wrong step, and I see a lot of climate activists in Africa saying is, carbon markets don't work, we don't want carbon markets, stop it. And I usually ask someone, so you're saying no one should send money to the stewards of the world's living rainforests to allow them to live a dignified life because somehow that's bad. And the people who are emitting, because they won't stop emitting because you stop the carbon market, but you're saying they should not be, in a sense, taxed for what they're doing. And when you frame it that way, what we are actually saying is, yeah, carbon markets should exist. The prices need to be higher, which is about really pricing the social cost of carbon, and the threshold for quality needs to be higher. And then finally, we need to get off our hind parts and actually get into the business of developing good quality, indigenously owned and developed carbon projects that are informed by the best science and the best regulation. That's the path of the future. I think it's an integral part of the future economy of the continent because we have an army of potential stewards of the planet who are sitting unemployed right now because the work that they do in taking care of nature is not valued by the market, and they're told that the only valuable tree is a dead one that's turned into firewood, right? So how do we get out of that is the carbon markets. One word just reminded me what the other part of
It was what you tell governments.
Sorry? Oh,
Sorry,
what do you tell
the 3 points when you're engaging and advising with governments.
I think it's really one, look at the scale of where this is and look at your relative endowments. Don't sweat your few million barrels of rather viscous crude in a corner of your country. Look at the fact that you're one of the top 20 countries in the world in terms of solar or some other endowment and play with that. You just did not realize this. 2, is there is concrete demand. There's people who want to do things and want to transact. And 3, there's a way to structure this that doesn't come out of the fiscus. That actually that you can attract investment to do this if you're willing to put in place the right regulatory environment. That's at least the advice. I think a lot of Africa's energy system development will not be driven by the Ministry of Energy. The Ministry of Energy will be a following ministry. To the extent that government will drive it in any way, it will be driven by trade and industry, by attracting new energy users and actually laying out plans for special economic zones and that kind of thing, green economic zones and so on, which is not the work of an energy ministry, it's the work of an industry ministry or a transport ministry in electrifying our transport and. And it's really understanding that solving our energy problem is a whole of government issue rather than a single ministry issue.
When Dele stands up, I always get worried. One last question.
Yes.
Were you standing up deliberately, Dele?
James? Something I said so offended
I
him.
know. You got to keep your eye on him. I'm watching my clock, okay?
James, thanks so much. I think a really, really compelling case. my one little worry is this isn't the first time we've had a good product
Yeah.
or a service and opportunity from the continent. And we've opened our doors, and there's been corporations that have invested and sort of, I won't be too expressive, but we
Yes.
were exploited for our resources. We've also facing a challenge of market integration, and I like the way you're presenting this as global economic integration of Africa, not just self-subsistence for our countries, right? But we've had barriers to entry to the market, and the economic hegemony in the world has made it very difficult for us. The reason why China has made it so big is because they have that gravitas on the world stage.
Yeah.
Now, us as individual countries in Africa, we don't have that negotiating power individually. So how do we have a collective bloc as Africa, the United States of Africa, or whatever we want to call it, to negotiate our assets on the world stage for global economic integration in that sort of way, and so that we can benefit truly from the product we're offering?
Quickly, James.
I do not have an answer for effective African multinational collective action yet, so I will actually say that there's something specific about this particular opportunity that makes it behave differently than others, and it's perhaps best captured in the Namibia example. It is entirely possible that $10 billion would be invested in Namibia with a pure extractive intent of taking green hydrogen to other places in the world. It is also true that on the day that first ship of hydrogen arrives where it's going to be used, investor is going to look at that process and say, I could undercut these guys on their end product if I just built a factory next to where the green hydrogen is coming from in Namibia. The underlying economic incentives, because of the hard-to-move nature of renewable energy and because of the role that energy plays in economic complexity, means that it's a really hard thing to abstract away. In a sense, what you then have to do is you need to invest here. You actually need to bring the complexity here, because here is where the energy is. And once you bring the complexity, then the regulatory power, then the negotiating power over time, it becomes a lot more analogous to how China became a big player on the global stage, which is they had a lot of labor, they attracted people in. Once you built the factory that's dependent on the labor, then the factory is there. And over time, the balance of power between the owner of the original IP and the owner of the factory shifts. Repeat that with renewable energy over the next 15 years, and you could see a similar effect. Because like I said, you can't teach latitude.
So James, there's the big red sign up there, which is a thumbs up. But already, I think, you know, when I listen, and I listen underneath what you're saying, I mean, you use the words that indigenous stewardship of the planet, which I think is really beautiful, but a lot of what you're speaking about is turning our thinking on its head. It's really changing the mindset and changing how we've always done things to open up these new possibilities of climate positive growth. And I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking James a lot. I'm sure you have lots of questions for bringing hope to the stage. So thank you very much, James.